I'm Peter Coyote, and this is Smothered by Riches. It's the biggest unanswered question in America today. Yes, it concerns Donald Trump, but it's not about him. It's about us. It asks why nearly half of Americans have lost faith in democratic institutions and government's ability to solve problems on their behalf. It considers why so many ordinary Americans have put their faith in a man who, time and again, has shown little regard for our norms and laws, or much of anything besides his obsession with himself. This documentary will suggest that the answer is the result of a plan and a strategy dedicated to altering our political and economic systems, privatizing our news media, and enlisting some of the nation's great fortunes to accomplish these goals. In the past 50 years, income for most Americans have either stagnated or diminished. There's more trauma in our lives. Wars seem endemic. Big business and the nation's wealthiest people, about 10% of the population, have amassed inconceivable wealth and power and live unencumbered by government regulations and societal obligations, while life for most others is stressed and uncertain. Many must hold 2 and 3 jobs to keep up. Most media, led by television, has sided with the corporate America and the shareholder class that owns them. Their strategies for maximizing profits and keeping consumer eyeballs available for their sponsors have dumbed down the news, shifting its focus to contests and competitions, who's winning and who's losing, decimating our common denominator of facts available for public decisions like voting. This vast transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it an accident. This current and exaggerated inequity began as a backlash to the 1960s youth counterculture and anti-Vietnam protests. People like myself, who grew up in the post-World War II shadow of the atomic bomb, McCarthy-era witch hunts and racist segregation, did not want to live that way. This impulse sometimes put us at odds with our parents' generation and leaders who saw in America's post-war power opportunities for enormous wealth, which they conceived of as the pinnacle of freedom. During this tumultuous period, a class of business people felt under attack from social rights protests to end the Vietnam War, guarantee women's rights, and support unions. Worst of all to big business were the attacks by consumer advocates like Ralph Nader and environmentalists, apparently stabbing the beating heart of what produced their wealth. Their remedy was simple: defend corporate wealth as an American birthright, threaten and counter critics in the media and on campuses, on every front, and roll back all federal regulations impeding profits. These defenders of profit-taking and privilege, attorneys, legislators, and captains of industry, set out to change society's progressive conversations, set out to change what was on the news and the premises by which newsrooms operated. And they did. Patiently, and in a disciplined and persistent manner, they engaged young billionaires like the Koch brothers, Richard Scaife Mellon and Joseph Coors, who funded them generously. They changed the conversation in America in ways that have only become clear by carefully tracking the results of their efforts over time. How they accomplished this, the key turning points along the way, and its impacts on the people, the majority of citizens, and on democracy of itself, is our subject.
Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same: we want to be free.
This transformation began in the most unlikely of ways. As a confidential memo written in 1971 by a tobacco industry lawyer named Lewis Powell. Powell was no ordinary lawyer. He'd soon be appointed to the Supreme Court by President Richard Nixon. He was wealthy, powerful, and connected, and furious at the assaults on the American system surrounding him. His memo to the United States Chamber of Commerce was a corporate manifesto, and more importantly, a call to arms. To understand Powell and the chain reaction he ignited, it's necessary to understand what he despised about America in the 1960s. Powell was born in 1907. He went to college and law school during the Great Depression. He was an intelligence officer in World War II. After the war, he became a corporate lawyer and served on Virginia school boards as racial desegregation unfolded. He sat on the board of directors at Philip Morris, the giant cigarette maker. In the mid-1960s, he gave speeches criticizing Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategy of nonviolence. He said government had done, quote, all it could for the Negro. Powell and his peers were corporation men. They saw themselves as industrious, can-do guys and the best of America. There were some economists at the time whose philosophy reinforced that view. Before and after World War II, a circle of scholars based in Chicago promoted a theory called neoliberalism. Despite its innocent-sounding name, they proclaimed that unregulated capitalism, the free market, and free enterprise would, like nature itself, adjust to current events, and if left alone and unregulated, create the most wealth for society. They preached that government oversight was not only unnecessary, but destructive. The neoliberals ignored the fact that runaway greed had launched the Great Depression, crippling the nation for more than a decade. They hated President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which used tax dollars to put people back to work and created safety nets like Social Security. President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and programs like Medicare, creating public universal health care for seniors, was equally abhorred and denigrated as more handouts. Quite naturally, many ordinary citizens demonstrated vociferously in favor of such programs. As Powell saw it, 1960s anti-capitalist, anti-war, and pro-integration and equity demands were too much. As Powell saw it, the backbone and premise of America's free enterprise system was under existential attack, and worse, corporate executives were not fighting back. As he wrote, "What concerns us now is quite new in the history of America. We're not dealing with episodic or isolated attacks from a relatively few extremists or even a minority socialist cadre. Rather, the assault on the enterprise system is broadly based and consistently pursued. It is gaining momentum and converts." Powell said campuses, the clergy, media, intellectual and literary journals, the arts, and scientists and politicians were questioning property rights and corporate profit-making. With few exceptions, he said corporate executives were cowering and appeasing these populist movements, especially environmentalism and consumerism. He wrote, "The painful, sad truth is that business, including the boards of directors and the top executives of corporations great and small, and business organizations at all levels, often have responded, if at all, by appeasement, ineptitude, and ignoring the problem. They've shown little stomach for hard-nosed contest with their critics, and little skill in effective intellectual and philosophical debate. The, quote, survival of what we call the free enterprise system, unquote, was at stake. The corporate sector had a patriotic duty to fight back. Powell wanted to erase the 1960s and somehow ignored that broadly based might include a majority of citizens. For him, the cultural conversations had to change. New think tanks, public intellectuals, political candidates, and business-minded judges were needed. Corporate faces had to appear regularly on TV to remind Americans that profits fueled society, that corporations and wealthy families endowed colleges and universities. Powell asked how much muscle, how much money, power, and influence was needed to be effective. Powell's memo didn't mince words. Its warlike tone showed no consideration of any moral concerns his opponents might share. He chided corporate leaders for surrendering the field to leftists, urged corporate America and its representatives to fund and create think tanks, called on conservative public intellectuals and lobbyists to champion their cause, to invent publicity strategies, and to dedicate time and money to elect and appoint sympathetic politicians and judges. The conversation in America had to change. Powell's confidential memo didn't get much press coverage in its day and appeared to drop from sight. In the early 1970s, liberalism, despite the ongoing Vietnam War, continued to dominate the news and culture. Congress passed landmark environmental laws. President Richard Nixon signed them. A women's equal rights amendment to the Constitution was passed and sent to the states. But some rich industrialists, among them young conservative millionaires like the Koch brothers, Richard Scaife Mellon and Joseph Coors and their heirs, took notice. New policy shops and advocates were seated in Washington with the money they provided. The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They called themselves conservatives, but that label, suggesting cautious thrift, camouflaged their right-wing and extremist goals. Their actual agenda was to deregulate and reverse decades of federal policy and programs that helped ordinary Americans, who they often recast as lazy and sponging off others. The plan gained momentum during successive decades, and by the 80s and 90s, compliant politicians had effectively dismantled key guardrails that had once served to protect the public interest. Gutting these restraints led to greed-driven economic crises and upheavals that bludgeoned the public. Meanwhile, in another kind of deregulation, network television in the 1960s changed from nonprofit to major profit centers for their corporate parents. The new strategies required massive numbers of viewers. Media executives also wanted profits, and in response, both Republican and Democratic presidents deregulated their industry. We'll investigate this more deeply in the next section. All of this had occurred even before the internet unfolded new and enormous space, splintering Americans' attentions even more. People no longer saw news reporting based on common facts. The range of analysis had become locked in, diminished. Common ground shrunk. Debate vanished and strife became the order of the day. Gerrymandering of political districts allowed politicians to choose their own voters, and dialogue became more extreme and doubt-free. Voters became increasingly tribal. Meanwhile, the wealthiest businesses and people prospered as federal regulations, consumer protections, and societal obligations were gutted. Sound familiar yet? It's hard to believe that this decades-long transformation began as corporate America's backlash against 60s liberalism, led by the staid U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's even harder to believe today's downward spiral of public trust in democratic institutions began with a 34-page war plan by a Virginia corporate lawyer who believed that, quote, America had done all it could for the Negro, end quote. But Lewis Powell's August 1971 memo launched an anti-democratic revolution that has literally changed the character of the nation, picking our wealthiest citizens and corporations as the winners and dedicating the rest of us as the losers, creating a system where the top 1% holds more wealth than the entire 60% of America's middle class, who hold about 26% of it. Low-income Americans, representing the bottom 20%, own about 3%. This is the story we must begin to investigate if we hope to understand why millions of Americans have lost faith in democratic institutions today. Powell's plan at work. The game plan laid out in Powell's memo was coldly unsympathetic to any populist issue or movement. Soon after his memo appeared, Nixon put Powell on the U.S. Supreme Court. About a decade later, the combined wealth and energy of the billionaire corporate class and their new institutional base of think tanks paid off. As the 1980s began, the nation's political pendulum swung to the right, and the election of Ronald Reagan as president secured for Powell's ideological stepchildren the authority and position to dismantle key checks and balances protecting ordinary citizens. Reagan was a Hollywood actor turned corporate pitchman who became a right-wing politician. In 1968, when he ran for governor of California and won, he made two campaign pledges: send welfare bums back to work and clean up the mess, meaning youth-fueled protests centered at the University of California in Berkeley. He ordered police and National Guards to crack down. They did, and neither ever apologized for the bloodshed and deaths Reagan's overreaction caused. As a new president, Reagan eagerly championed Powell's pro-corporate orthodoxy. Despite campaigning for union support and being the president of the Screen Actors Guild Union, who simultaneously spied for the FBI on labor organizers, as president he broke a strike by federal employees, air traffic controllers, firing more than 11,000 workers and banning those who would not return from that occupation for life. He put industrial lobbyists in charge of environmental policy and federal land management. And crucially, Reagan's political appointees launched a change in the fundamental mission and the business of television news, a seismic shift that still generates aftershocks today. At the time Powell wrote his memo, TV newsrooms followed a long-time federal policy called the Fairness Doctrine. It declared that the public airwaves belonged to the people, and therefore required the networks to present facts and discuss them fairly from multiple points of view. News divisions didn't make money. They had a different calling. They focused on clear, fair reporting and analysis to earn the public's trust. But starting in the 70s, new libertarian policy shops like the Heritage Foundation began attacking the Fairness Doctrine, claiming that it was impinging on free speech. At the same time, TV executives could not help but notice the unexpected success of CBS's 60 Minutes, which presented news in a more entertaining manner. The networks realized their newsrooms could be transformed into major profit centers, and pirouetting like a toe-dancing ballerina, the purpose and formats of television news changed radically. When Reagan became president in the early 1980s, the big three TV networks were facing growing competition from new cable and satellite opportunities. These new upstarts programmed differently. Many channels had single-issue focuses, such as all sports, shopping, or breaking news. The big networks continued to be watched by tens of millions of people every day, and their executives wanted to keep those viewers. They traded out the older gold standard newsreaders like Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow for younger, sexier hosts. TV news no longer dug deep or probed why the system was convulsing on so many fronts. They told us about the price of gas, but never why it rose. Showed us the horrors of mass murder by weapons of war legalized on our streets, another type of deregulation, but never explained the funding structures of our political system, ensuring that military-grade weapons were never removed and the corporate profits of their manufacturers diminished. TV newsrooms were told to lighten up on substance and analysis because it was too staid and expensive. The new game was to grab viewers' attention and keep it. News directors were instructed to sculpt stories mimicking the pace, uncertainty, and breathless style of sports reporting. History, detail, and debate receded. Issues with gray areas became black or white, pick-a-side options. Present the headlines, summarize, skip history, causes, and nuance, hype winners and losers, black and white choices, and cover personalities over policies. Introduce experts and think tanks, but don't reveal too much about them. Who funds them, for instance. Just treat them all equally as experts. Reporting and informed debate was replaced by opining talking heads, and this new infotainment became very profitable. Reagan, a former actor and corporate pitchman, knew what network brass and right-wing ideologues wanted. In 1987, the Federal Communications Commission, all appointed by the president, repealed the Fairness Doctrine, claiming that it had harmed free speech. The previous norm legally required presentation of facts and competing viewpoints. That drowned beneath the rising tides of hundreds of new options. Freed of the restraints of fairness, right-wing talk radio was first to proliferate like thistles in an abandoned pasture. Shock jocks mocked liberals and their ideas. There were no rebuttals. As its audiences grew, right-wing politicians copied their style and rhetoric. A generation later, the same template was transferred to online social media. What's now clear, but not appreciated at the time, is that media deregulation put American culture and politics on a path toward more polarized and hateful extremes. These changes did not arrive due to the election of a charismatic right-wing president. They were part of a longer-term plan to ensure the dominance of a free market ideology and minimized federal oversight. And it wasn't just Republicans who accommodated the advocates of unregulated capitalism. In 1996, President Bill Clinton deregulated media ownership rules. Until then, corporations could not own more than one TV or radio station in a single market. That law was repealed, and a wave of acquisitions and mergers ensued. Across America, cities and regions that previously supported competing newsrooms and TV stations saw their information sources dwindle. That consolidation occurred a decade before online and social media platforms emerged in the early 2000s, and a new generation of content creators and audiences emerged. Online platforms enticed people to delve more deeply into their personal interests. Invisible algorithms tracking their posts ensured they would meet other like-minded people. They did, and soon formed self-reinforcing communities. Meanwhile, online media's new titans gained enormous wealth, which adroitly dispersed, protected them from any regulation. They fostered a revolutionary realignment with no checks and balances to protect ordinary people against counterfactual information, rumor, and gossip. This continues today. This evolution meant there was also less common ground for any mutual understanding of the underlying causes and potential solutions to society's gravest afflictions. At the same time, corporate thirst for profits grew, and prior regulations in many industries were repealed by compliant politicians. Some viewers may be too young to remember the 80s industry-wide bank failures caused by deregulation. That savings and loan scandal where loan officers were lending themselves customers' money and sucked $250 billion from pension and local savings accounts. After Jimmy Carter's Fed chair raised interest rates 5 points in a single day, family farms throughout the Midwest failed. Their goods were auctioned off and they were snapped up by agro-industry corporations. Some farmers were hired back, others migrated to distant cities looking for work. Younger people will certainly remember the 2000 housing crashes and mass evictions, the failures of massive accounting firms due to liar's loan mortgages, and lies by the regulating agencies certifying the solidity of such investments. Millions were evicted as a result of this collapse. The common thread in all these crises was the unchecked and unregulated pursuit of profit run amok. Perhaps younger people weren't paying attention as GATT-NAFTA legislation allowed American jobs to be shipped overseas to countries without unions, health and safety or environmental laws for cheaper labor. Small towns and urban cores across America withered and have never fully recovered. Once busy main streets were boarded up. Manufacturing went overseas. Working-class paychecks barely kept up with living costs. And in the absence of affordable child care, many could not go to work because it meant abandoning their children. America's new geography. Today, 2 decades later, is it any wonder that nearly half of Americans get their news and listen to opinion leaders that the other half doesn't trust? Is it surprising when differing political parties have evolved into tribes that denigrate each other with disciplined talking points, but rarely offer solutions? That the Supreme Court allows gerrymandering, permitting politicians to choose their voters, which has led to minority rule in many locations? Is it surprising that the wealthiest Americans are absolved of responsibility to pay their fair share of taxes required by solutions? Is it surprising that Americans almost never hear on the news how European countries have addressed the same problems that we have, with more helpful and constructive results? The fragmentation of media and information has allowed corporate America to divide and conquer the public's attentions. The internet may have made that fracturing inevitable, but it also hijacked the nation's attention and facilitated the scripting of right-wing talking points, now heard and taken as gospel by half the electorate. This condition remains as the rich rewards of Lewis Powell's vision for the self-chosen few. Powell once cringed as academics, clergy, publishers, and TV broadcasters promoted leftist causes. Today, the pendulum has completely shifted. Democrats and progressives cringe as right-wingers demand the rewriting public school curricula, curtail reproductive rights, censor library books, and claim that elections and the courts are rigged whenever they don't win. If we step back from these attention-grabbing anti-democratic developments of extreme views, we can clearly see what has happened to our political, economic, and media systems. They have not just become more edgy, angry, and unhinged. They have become fundamentally unbalanced. Counterfactuals, the enhancement of dread, and powerful interests don't just compete, they monopolize. The political system is organized around money and consequently responds more readily to private wealth than public interests. They need to raise vast sums in order to run for office and remain in power, skewing elected officials' attentions and loyalties. The economic system continues to reward the capitalist class far more than ordinary Americans. If you doubt this, look no further than examining which wedge of society is vacuuming out people's wallets, purses, and labor to pay themselves handsomely, while those represented by the rest of the pie are left worrying about bills, health care, safety, and quality of life concerns. Mainstream media, too, remains extraordinarily unbalanced and deferential to conservative ideas and commentators, despite the insistence of some that the world's largest corporations are too skewed left. That insistence has been an effective way to push the center to the right. Media is largely a private profit-seeking sector. That priority has aligned network executives with other corporate leaders. Not only has more detailed and serious news and analysis been replaced by infotainment, but an even more insidious and troubling development has occurred. What are currently regarded as serious and reasonable topics fit for mainstream audiences has been redefined and pushed far to the right. The political center, presented as the zone where grown-ups reach compromises, is no longer the center of the ideological spectrum. It has moved to the right, where today conspiratorial and fringe ideas are uncritically presented as having equal weight to ideas based on facts, evidence, and science. And news show hosts, fearful of being attacked as liberal, restrain themselves from calling out misinformation and lies. Personal charisma, aggression, and certainty have buried data, cordiality, and investigation. That's not all. There's no counterpoint, no available venue for ideas, solutions, and track records from the center-left or progressive left. Americans are almost never exposed to information about how our European, Scandinavian, and Asian allies solve many of the problems which continue to stymie American culture in schooling, healthcare, and social safety nets. All such arguments are drowned out by the chant that those countries have higher taxes, with no discussion of what the public receives for them. Meanwhile, average Americans continue to foot the tax bill, income, sales, use, and gas, and receive very little for it compared to those countries. We remain stuck with our apocalyptic culture wars, endless emails from candidates seeking money, and overpromising and undelivering political system. Might not Americans want to know what's really driving inflation or student loan interest rates? Might they not appreciate real data explaining why our health insurance routinely denies, delays, or legislates claims? There are so many examples. Must every transaction be profit-driven? Why don't wealthy interests pay their fair share? Our political system continues to expect profit-making entities to solve needs and problems where there are few profits to be had. And when they do not, those problems remain unaddressed. Other wealthy capitalist countries leave certain basic services in the public sector to operate break-even for the public good and still have plenty of economic room for wealth production and entrepreneurs. Why can't our media universe even examine such possibilities? We do not hear those kinds of questions and discussions on mainstream media. When those topics arise, we don't hear the full range of ideas and options and examine what others have done to address them. Did they succeed or fail, and why? Considering the economic fluctuations, recessions, and gross inequities produced by American capitalism during the past half-century, it's rather remarkable that so little criticism to address the flaws inherent in our unregulated capitalist system are ever discussed by our mass media. All of this returns us to where we began. The biggest unanswered question in America right now is not, what will Trump do next? It is, why have millions of Americans lost faith in democratic institutions? I hope that this discussion might begin to answer that question. We see mobs cheering at Trump rallies. We worry about his dictatorial threats, but remain puzzled by why people voted for him. Before we surrender to the reign of money controlling our politics, economics, and media, let's remember that these systems were consciously created. Decades of deliberate decisions to elevate the interests of free enterprise above average Americans brought us here. Let us remember that which has been rendered by political power can be undone by it. In the final analysis, it will be the voters who can and must show up at the polls and in our daily political life, but show up perhaps differently than we have heretofore. Powell's minions have manipulated millions to believe that there is an us and them, and that the them represent a threat. The consequences of that way of thinking have revealed that what happens to the least of our citizens when they're stripped of constitutional protections, equal access to good jobs, fair mortgages, good schools, and agency weakens the one foundational belief that makes us a nation: democracy. Whether or not the United States can remain a democracy will finally be determined by whether or not each of us can open our hearts and understanding. Not to be grandiose, but it's a spiritual revolution that allows us to include our fellow citizens with less education or wealth, darker skins, and sometimes unfamiliar accents in our understanding of what being an American means. And it will be a spiritual revolution for them to include white people when they are no longer the majority. Why are we not setting examples and practicing for that impending political fact? Strangers will always be consigned to powerlessness unless the majority includes them in their definition of community. This is a larger task than simply community organizing. It must include hearts, eyes that see others with more kindness and less fear, understanding that it is the generosity of the sun, water, oxygen, and soil which supports all life, including our own. It is not a private possession of the privileged. Those banished from our definition of community will eventually turn against it. What's called for is a revelation of understanding, a recognizing of what citizenship and democracy truly mean and imply. That is not different than the fundamental assertions of every religion. It is not foreign. We can do this. There is enough for everyone, particularly when democracy assumes its authority of truly representing the majority and protecting the minority. As Lewis Powell wrote in his infamous August 1971 memo, the most disquieting voices joining the chorus of criticism come from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals, the arts and scientists, and from politicians. Give Powell credit, but let's flip his script. Powell identified the system's players and levers. His neoliberal call to arms was prescient and provoked concerted action. But the first step to turn the tide and conversation is knowing how we got here and the painful anti-democratic impacts it's had on us all. I'm Peter Coyote, and this has been Smothered by Riches.